Welcome to Kitchen Sink Dharma. Now, do you ever wish you were a better person? Or maybe there's a gap between the person you are and the person you think you really ought to be. I know I used to spend a lot of time wishing I could do better, or maybe be a better self. Certainly a less stressed self, but at the same time a harder working self, maybe a more appealing, kinder, but at the same time better at saying no to people. Maybe less of a time waster. Or maybe someone better off but less interested in money. And I would look at other people with a little bit of envy, people who seem to have worked it all out. And I would come up with New Year's resolutions and then quickly forget them. And I would actually get quite annoyed at myself. I remember as a student saying to myself, right, from now on I'm really going to get it together. I'm going to start working hard, and it starts today. I'm going to put my head down and get a first class honours. And then the next day I'd be missing lectures and drinking too much again. And I actually thought the answer was willpower. And I thought I ought to be in charge of my mind. But the answer wasn't willpower. And I certainly wasn't in charge of my mind. And I wasn't that happy even. I didn't even have a very good opinion of myself. And when we talk about change can be difficult, especially when it comes from a sense of not being good enough. Because our habits tend to be stronger than our willpower. And habits and mental patterns tend to form below the level of consciousness. They're a kind of learning system. And we know it takes a while for them to form, and it often takes a while for them to break. And the way that our patterns and habits work is they're like cutting a path through the jungle. If we keep walking the same way, it becomes a path, and then a road, then ultimately a motorway. And scientists talk about neural pathways, but Buddhists call them sankharas. But we're talking about the same thing. A lot of what we do is automatic. And that's important, that's helpful. It uses less bandwidth. So we clean our teeth every night before bed, and that's a helpful habit. We don't have to think about it too much. When we drive a car, we don't have to think about every action before we do it. It's a kind of autopilot. But of course, autopilot can often be unhelpful as well. So as a student, my patterns included drinking too much and staying up all night and missing lectures. And it's not just external behavioural habits that we have secret inner habits, we have secret inner patterns as well. And these include habits that make us miserable. It's habits like compulsive overthinking, constantly reacting to things, constantly being irritated with people, habits of avoidance and dissociation. And these habits are always rooted in the past. They're based on some adaptation that we've made that's no longer useful. And we tend to be quite self-aware about the patterns that are causing us suffering. Even if we can't break those habits and patterns, we tend to be aware of them. And it brings me on to the subject of intentions. In Buddhism, we talk a lot about intentions. Recently, I talked about wise intention, which is the second factor of the Eightfold Path. And we're taught that there are wholesome intentions. So we're encouraged to lean towards renunciation and towards letting go. We're encouraged to lean away from less wholesome intentions, like ill will and harming other people. This leads to a reduction in our suffering if we lean away from those things for ourselves and for others. But the teachings from early Buddhism don't just say change your behavior. They also talk about what lies beneath the behavior. And we're taught that the deepest patterns are those of craving and aversion and ignorance. When we talk about craving and aversion, it's wanting what we haven't got and really not wanting what we have got. And these habits are generated at an unconscious level. We know we can't change the unconscious mind through willpower alone and repression. It doesn't really work. We just end up getting into a fight with ourselves. We get into a fight with the mind, and inevitably we lose. And there's no actual self in charge of the mind, although we like to think there is. It's just the mind. And a lot of it's running on autopilot. And this is one of the things that first got me interested in insight meditation. Because one of the first things I found when I tried that out was that the mind can be peaceful. Now there are times when I feel very peaceful and the ego just calms right down. And this especially happens when I'm on retreat. But however peaceful and still we are at the surface level, at a deeper level, Our tendency to grasp and react and suffer doesn't go away, it doesn't just disappear. So this is a few lines from the Dhammapada. It goes, if the roots remain untouched and firm in the ground, a felled tree still puts forth new shoots. If the underlying habit of craving and aversion is not uprooted, suffering arises anew, over and over again. So insight meditation is concerned with going deep. It's concerned with going deep and changing our conditioning and really uprooting the source of our suffering. And we do this by cultivating insight into the nature of our experience and the nature of our suffering. This is very, very clearly set out in a teaching called the Satipatthana Sutta. It's the instructions on the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And we uproot our conditioning through direct observation of our experience, including the experience of physical sensations. And we start to become disenchanted with the whole constant cycle of wanting and not wanting and wanting and not wanting, and the whole grasping things and pushing things away. And that changes the way that we experience the world. And it's not a quick fix, as you would expect if you're dealing with patterns that are very deep and very entrenched. It takes time, and it begins with intention. Because at some point we have to decide, I want to do things differently. I want to do things differently. I'm interested in being free and remaining steady, whatever's going on around me. And it helps when we're on this path to have the humility to know that we're going to stumble and fall many times. And it helps to have a willingness to keep getting up again. So if we're going to create new paths through the jungle, it's going to require patience and a great deal of repetition. So if we keep reconnecting with our intentions over and over, then gradually, after however long it takes, we start to reshape the mind, we start to rewire the neurons, if you like. This is transformational. And there are certain conditions needed to do this. We're only going to do this if we think it matters, if we think it's worth it. If we actually believe it's worth doing. Also, if we're feeling sufficiently safe and stable and resourced. We can't do this in the middle of a crisis. So in my experience, everything can go flying out the window sometimes. If you're feeling exhausted or threatened or anything else. But when the time is right again, it's possible to reconnect with those intentions. We can remind ourselves of what matters and just start again. And I want to talk about something else that's important, something that's usually hidden from us, something that's often referred to as our Buddha nature. The teacher John Prendergast talks about an underlying wholeness in the depths of our being. One of the things we can do is actually drop the attention into the heart area. It's one way of connecting with our own fullness, our own essential goodness, our sense of belonging. You don't have to be a Buddhist to do this. You don't have to be a Buddhist to recognize your Buddha nature. If you can find some way of connecting with this aspect of yourself, your basic goodness, changes everything. And all of the desire and the hostility and the resentment and everything else just subsides, it just disappears. You become much less anxious about whether you're going to get what you want or not, and the mind just becomes naturally more content. And then there isn't any need for willpower, none at all. Renunciation happens all by itself. Friendliness and compassion arise more easily when you're not actually depending on external circumstances to feel good about yourself. Nothing actually makes any sense except for compassion and friendliness, including compassion and friendliness towards yourself. And this is a very good basis for insight meditation. Because for most people right now, the chances are your mind isn't really under your control. And all these habits and patterns are still there. They haven't been uprooted, and the craving is still there, and the aversion. And it's certainly true in my case. Some of my thoughts are still not kind. I still have some avoidant tendencies. But despite all of this, I've made a commitment to be patient with myself. And I'm going to keep coming back and reconnecting with my intentions and my basic goodness, my Buddha nature. Not because I should or anyone says I ought to, but just because I want to. So if you're serious about your intentions, here's what I think is much more powerful and effective than willpower. And it's to give yourself permission to love yourself. And I'm sorry if that sounds a bit like it's from a self-help book or a Hallmark card. But there isn't a more direct way to say this. You have to forgive yourself. You have to forgive yourself for your forgetfulness, your irrationality, your vulnerability, everything else that you think is wrong with you. Because being patient with yourself and loving yourself isn't actually a form of self-indulgence. You don't have to wrestle with your mind anymore. You can just do the absolute opposite. Give it what it needs. See the good in yourself. Know that it's there. And notice it and water it and give it space to grow. And then even if you keep falling over and having to get back up again, you'll have the resources to do that. It's going to take you much closer to your deeper intentions than willpower ever can. So thanks for listening to Kitchen Sink Dharma.